There's just well-meaning, if wounded, people. That actually cuts to the main division between the radical and liberal perspectives, as Cameron has already addressed. But power is not a mistake, out of which the powerful can be educated. It's not a misunderstanding, and it's not a disagreement. And what that means is that justice cannot be won by rational argument, by moral exhortation, by personal transformation, or by some kind of spiritual epiphany. It's won by taking power away from the powerful and then dismantling their institutions. So we've already had the categories of response that Cameron's gone over. I just want to reiterate that none of these are liberal or radical on their own. They can all overlap in ways that are really crucial to resistance movements, that they can all be diversions that just dead end. And I want to talk about withdrawal for a moment, because I see withdrawal right now as this place where the environmentally conscious have crawled to die. The main difference between withdrawal as a successful strategy and withdrawal as a failed strategy is whether that withdrawal is seen as intimately linked to a political struggle, or whether it's seen as adequate in itself. And that cuts again right to that division between radical and liberal. The issues of identification, of loyalty, those are really crucial to building the political consciousness that's necessary for a resistance movement. But that alone is not enough. The withdrawal has got to go beyond the intellectual, the emotional, the psychological, to include a goal of actually winning justice. Withdrawal may give solace, but ultimately it will change nothing. And living in a rarefied bubble world of the converted will not get us there, and it will certainly not save our planet. So we're going to take all of this, give you an example, just sort of a real-life example to walk you through. And I picked the Irish struggle for independence. So the Irish had endured English occupation for over 800 years, the usual array of horrors. Now in 1880, there's a movement that starts called the Gaelic Revival. Now this movement sought to bring self-respect and cultural pride to the Irish as Irish. So they start teaching the language, which was going extinct. Music, dance, theater, all of these are really ancient traditions in Ireland. So they had a lot to build on. And then you have people like Maud Gunn. And if you don't know who she was called the Irish Joan of Arc, and you should go home and look her up. And her son, Sean McBride. Everything you need to know about a resistance movement is embodied in her life. So this was the newspaper that she put out. And then you have the Gaelic Athletic Association. So what, they're running around playing games? Actually, no. They revived traditional Irish sports, that's how they began. But this proved to be a training ground for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which is what becomes the IRA. So they're not just running around playing games. They're learning how to work as a team, they're learning how to strategize, and they're learning how to be physically strong. So all of this comes together, the Gaelic Revival, in what's called the Land War. Now, this is a struggle that gets started to win back land ownership. There's tremendous poverty, starvation, hunger, famine, all across Ireland. They've lost control of the land. And this is a struggle to win back the land. It's extremely successful. By the year 1914, 90% of the land was once again held by small and medium-sized farmers. So they did it. And it was won almost entirely using nonviolent techniques, mostly these rent strikes and boycott. In fact, the word boycott comes from Captain Boycott, and it comes from this struggle. So every time you say that, you're actually referring back to the Irish struggle. But I love the language in this old stuff of the 19th century. Redeem your character now. Don't you have like a list of people you want to say that to? Redeem your character now, sir. We don't talk about character anymore, and we really need to bring this back. Anyway, from there, from the Land War, they had this great success. This is what launches the struggle for actual independence. Now, it all starts with that Gaelic Revival, okay, with the culture of resistance. Nobody said, well, let's just put on some nice plays, and we'll sing our own songs, and the English will go away. Nobody said, let's just change our consciousness, okay? If we can think nice thoughts and love each other, that'll do the trick. We need to just be the change that we wish to see. We don't need to challenge a corrupt and brutal system of power. No, we've got this magic trick called consciousness. That's not what happened. The Irish culture of resistance believed in resistance, it encouraged it, it planned for it, it supported it, and it prepared for its success. So they did everything from support for political prisoners, to feeding starving children, to support for families that were having trouble. They set up their own court system to settle disputes, and they ultimately demanded loyalty to Ireland and the Irish cause. Eventually, this leads to both violent and nonviolent confrontation with the English power system. And it was basically successful. But they used all three categories. So they used the legal, they used direct action, and they used that withdrawal. But they understood how they all work together. Part of withdrawal that's necessary is breaking through that psychology of the oppressed. Now, people survive oppressive conditions using three basic psychological mechanisms. So that would be denial, accommodation, and ultimately consent. So if they had but known they were slaves, right? Breaking through that psychology is crucial. It may, in fact, be the hardest job that we have as radicals. We could follow the same trajectory from, for instance, the Harlem Renaissance through the Civil Rights Movement. Any number of struggles follows the same pattern. Developing self-respect, basic political consciousness, loyalty to your own, that's crucial, right? But it's not enough. So it's necessary but not sufficient. So why is so much of the left insisting on personal solutions, withdrawal as the main political strategy, with this vague millennialism as a fallback? Well, we need a little more history here. My ex always says that history is same characters, different costumes, and we are about to find out exactly how right she is. So, gosh, there's a lot of history in this one. We don't have time. Trust me on this, though. This goes back a good 3,000 years in the West, really to ancient Greece, but we're going to pick this up with the Romantic movement. Now, this is an artistic movement that gets going in the late 18th century in Western Europe. It's at least in part a reaction against the Age of Enlightenment. So, this ascendancy of science and rationality. The cosmos at one point was, the main image of the cosmos was as a living body. And all of a sudden, it's replaced by clockwork. The cosmos is now a machine. It's no longer alive. And the Industrial Revolution kicks in gear. So this is what's happening across Europe. And what it means on the ground is that the rivers, the forests, the wetlands are falling to the Industrial Revolution. People are being pushed off their land into urban squalor. This is the same story everywhere. Okay, it never has a happy ending. So this is a hard time in Europe. The Romantic movement gets going, partly a reaction to this. And there's three themes of the Romantic movement. You have the evocation of the past, you've got the isolation of the individual, and then this reconnection with nature. Germany in particular produces a lot of romanticism's art and the music and whatnot, reasons we can't get into, but that's sort of the epicenter of all of this. And out of that comes this group of people called the Lebensreform movement. Now, this is a social movement that emphasizes physical fitness and natural health. Any of this sound a wee bit familiar? These are all variations on that theme of reconnecting to nature. Now, everybody from Isadora Duncan to Leon Trotsky to Franz Kafka passes through this world at some point. Gandhi was actually a fan of Lebensreform. He sets up a nature cure clinic in India. So it goes east, and what comes west, of course, is Buddhism, Hinduism, meditation, yoga. So there's this sort of cross-fertilization amongst these people. The Lebensreform, they set up their own clinics, their own schools, alternative communities. This is the big one. This is Ascona in Switzerland. This is like the big sur of the age. Now, some of the Lebensreform, there's school teachers in Berlin, high school teachers. And the whole idea is to get at nature, so they start taking their students out on hikes. And the hikes extend into weekends, and eventually this actually coalesces into a lifestyle. These middle-class teenagers drop out of these middle-class lives, and they form their own subculture. And now we come to the Wandervogel. Now, I'm real curious. How many of you have ever heard of the Wandervogel? That's more than I've ever seen. Well, you know the drill. Ignorant of history, condemned to repeat it. 90% of what's wrong on the left really goes back to these people. So, they start to coalesce into their own group. This is what they value: the rural, the emotional, spontaneity. They sing folk songs. They dress in this pseudo-peasant garb. They play with fasting, vegetarianism, raw foods, and they embrace all these ecological ideas. Now, this is all before the year 1900, okay? It's also the, it's the infrastructure for the youth hostel movement, because they start taking over abandoned buildings across the German countryside. Anybody can stay there for free. And this literally becomes the youth hostel movement. So they're the anarchy-speaking squatters of the age. The connection between the Lebensreform and the Wandervogel youth to the 1960s counterculture in this country are startlingly direct. So for instance, here's the painters. There are two painters that set the artistic style of the age. This is all 1900. This is not 1965. What I have, the red arrow up there, as a peace sign. So they're already using the peace sign. It's transplanted whole. World War I comes. A lot of them are draft resistors, so they leave Germany. And where do they go? You're not going to do this in Minnesota. They go to California. And this is a book all about this immigration process. Other examples, all of these books get taken up by the hippies in Haight-Ashbury 50 years later. But trust me, this is an unbroken line of cultural continuity. So what we have is an alternative culture. What we need is an oppositional culture, a culture of resistance. I started making this chart to try to figure out, all right, what are the differences? And suddenly I get the light bulb experience. What I was looking at was a culture created by the adolescent brain. In the year 1911 in Germany, there were more 17-year-olds than there ever would be again. Okay? So it comes to the United States, it goes dormant about 50 years, starts to pick up speed with the beatniks. What happens in 1960? It's another bumper crop of teenagers. And of course this is what they're attracted to. It's a culture created by people exactly like them. Now, I've been everywhere across this continuum, sometimes all at once. But the difference between an alternative culture and an oppositional culture, this is actually a split to the root that is been between the romantics and the resistance. Really, it's been there for centuries, the split. Now, they both start with some rejection of the established social order. But they identify their enemy differently, and from there they head in opposite directions. The first difference is really obvious. Are you apathetic to political engagement? Or do you consciously embrace resistance? That would be pretty key. The focus on the individual is a hallmark of liberalism. So, personal example becomes political strategy, and hence this emphasis on things like your personal carbon footprint. Am I the only one who's noticed? When you talk about carbon footprint, that is the only time that men try to prove they're smaller. Just saying. So let's talk about example as a political strategy. Now, by their nature, agricultural societies are imperialist because they're based on drawdown. So they're always going out and conquering the neighboring regions, bringing the resources back in. Over and over for 10,000 years. That is the pattern that civilization follows. Now, some of the indigenous people in those surrounding areas, they embody the values that everyone in this room holds dear. Okay, they're peaceful, egalitarian, sustainable cultures. And in all that time, over all those invasions, the face-to-face example of an egalitarian, sustainable culture has never once changed the invaders. Okay? It has never once brought on an epiphany amongst the invaders. That's never once. The dominant culture will not change because it sees the beautiful nonviolent values that we embody, and it will not change because it beholds our beautiful free-range compost piles. Okay? Personal example does not work. We are going to have to give this one up because there is way too much at stake. Now, the farthest extreme of individualism is where personal lifestyle becomes personal purity, and identity itself is declared a political act. And this is where subcultures start to develop us. But any strategy that is based on individual change is doomed to fail because of oppression, subordination. These are not individual conditions. They're group conditions, they're class conditions, and they take group effort to bring them down. So, the defining characteristic of an oppositional culture, on the other hand, is that it seriously claims to be that cradle of resistance. So where the alternative culture exists to create personal change, the oppositional culture exists to nurture a serious movement for political transformation. It understands that concrete systems of power have to be dismantled, and that such a project will require tremendous commitment, risk, and even loss of life. But that focus on the individual is where liberalism and the adolescent brain dovetail perfectly. Now, the adolescent brain is still under construction. Basically, the areas of the brain that are responsible for things like impulse control, for long-range planning, for considering consequences, those aren't working when you're a teenager. Adolescents literally cannot understand cause and effect. And also, our sense of time is not fully developed until we're 21. So these are people who cannot do long-range planning. They're prone to risk-taking, they're prone to impulsive behavior, flashes of anger, that overall emotional intensity. You all remember what it felt like to be 13. And that phase of life is really when the question of identity, of who I am, becomes so important. And that's okay. That's your job when you're a teenager. There's nothing wrong with that. You have to figure that out. The problem is when you have a youth culture instead of the culture of resistance. So what happens? Well, the idea of authority is rejected out of hand, where a serious resistance movement would instead be training the appropriate people for leadership positions. The alternative culture sees the enemy as this constraining set of values, of convention.